and gentlemen, please remain standing for the Please be seated. The chorus will now perform Dreaming of Home, a song they sang at the rededication ceremony of the Canadian National Vimy Memorial in France. La chorale des jeunes interprétera maintenant Dreaming of Home, chanson qu'elle a chantée lors de la redédication de la cérémonie du site commémoratif national canadien à Vimy en France. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the podium Mr. Robert Cyr, new chairman of the Fathers of Confederation Buildings Trust, and Mr. Claude Métra, Quebec delegate and member of the Symons Medal Committee. Mesdames et messieurs, Monsieur Robert Cyr, président du groupe fiduciaire des édifices des Pères de la Confédération, et Monsieur Claude Métra, délégué du Québec et membre du comité de la médaille Symons.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 18th Symons Medal Ceremony and Lecture on the state of Canadian Confederation. Before we proceed, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Don Fraser and the Confederation Centre Youth Choir for that superb performance. Your Honor, Lieutenant Governor Antoinette Perry, the Honourable Premier Wade McLaughlin, Chief Justice David Jenkins, Councillor Mike Duffy, Professor Tom Symons, Mr. Steve Bellamy, CEO of the Confederation Centre, Mr. George Kitching, co-chair of the Symons Medal Committee, Dr. Margaret MacMillan, ladies and gentlemen.
En cette 18e édition de la remise de la médaille Symons, je tiens à souligner l'esprit visionnaire du président du Conseil et des membres du groupe fiduciaire qui ont voulu que cet événement se déroule dans les 2 langues officielles du Canada. Cette conférence a comme objectif majeur d'offrir une occasion aux citoyens émérites du Canada de venir exprimer leur vision sur l'état de la Confédération canadienne et son avenir.
The medal ceremony is held each fall here at the Confederation Centre to mark the anniversary of the first meetings of the Fathers of Confederation in Charlottetown in 1864. The Confederation Centre was built to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Charlottetown Conference. The 2019 Symons Medal and Lecture would not be possible if it was not for the generous support of the Department of Canadian Heritage, the province of Prince Edward Island, and the city of Charlottetown.
Nous tenons également à remercier Robert et Kimberly Sear tout leur appui que les fonds de dotation suivants se font annuellement des contributions à la remise de la médaille et de la causerie Symons. Le fonds de Frank and Dorothy Lewis, le fonds de dotation Symons. J'invite maintenant l'honorable Wade McLaughlin, Premier ministre de la province, à vous dire quelques mots de bienvenue. Premier McLaughlin, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Quoi? Your Honor, distinguished guests, which means all of you, I want to make particular recognition and extend a warm Prince Edward Island welcome to Tom and Christine Symons and to Dr. Margaret MacMillan. This 2018 Symons Lecture and conferring of the Symons Medal and the existence of this series is a testament to Tom Symons' passion for Canada and his generosity toward Prince Edward Island and to this centre. In early October, Professor Symons called and we had a phone conversation. He said, Wade, this year we'd like you to say something about Canada and Confederation. So in the course of our conversation, we observed that in less than 4 years since I was first Premier of Prince Edward Island, I've now become the second most senior among Canadian provincial premiers. That's a lot of change, and it might remind us of the precarious work that some of us have. And also a reminder that we changed prime ministers during that time as well. As for what I might say about Canada and our evolving confederation, I might add in 3 minutes, I accept that challenge and will touch on 2 themes. The first is that we've seen a rise of populism in Canadian politics, paralleled by similar developments in the United States, in Europe, in Latin America, and elsewhere. There's nothing wrong in principle with making a country great again, or with being engaged with the people and listening to them and encouraging the people to have confidence in their future. The downside is the extent to which populism trades in fear, in division, in oversimplification, and isolation, as opposed to the hard work, and I might say the harder work, of inclusion, engagement, shared prosperity, evidence-based governance, and national and global citizenship. In her 2010 book, Dangerous Games, The Uses and Abuses of History, Dr. Margaret MacMillan warned against the manipulation of history to justify religious movements or political campaigns. At the time, we were focused on wars in Iraq, Central Africa, and the former Yugoslavia, among others. Today, we turn this critical lens closer to home. We have had 3 provincial elections in Canada in 2018, in Ontario, New Brunswick, and Quebec. To varying degrees, each of those elections turned on elements of populism, of fear of the other, or of an entitlement or opportunity unfairly denied. It hasn't been to the same extent as the frenzy over the caravans or voter fraud in the US midterms, but with sufficient volume that we should be concerned about our ability to continue to build and enjoy a free, democratic, and inclusive society with shared prosperity. It's easier to take a step toward populism than it is to step back. Now for my second theme, I might say more optimistic, about Canada and Confederation. Simply, and I hope we'll all take this away, Canada needs more Prince Edward Island. I love to say about Prince Edward Island that we are small but mighty, and I'm not alone. That we are a place that you can get your arms around. As Canadians, we regularly remind ourselves that we are vast, or that we have the world's longest coastline, or that we are the world's second biggest country by area. We have a long list of biggest this and that. The biggest dinosaur in Drumheller, the largest axe in Nakawik, New Brunswick, the largest hockey stick in Duncan, BC. And there's nothing wrong with that, especially if it's for local pride and promotion. But we should be telling ourselves more, not that we are vast, but that we know each other, that we're tiny and intimate in global terms. And we have examples in the room today. Tom Symons' lifelong attachment to Prince Edward Island started when someone picked him up hitchhiking many decades ago. Margaret MacMillan has been to our home for a meal, and we've been to hers. She spent childhood vacations in Prince Edward Island. As Premier, I spend a significant amount of time attending wakes, and some of my closest connections in life are with former students. And that's what the world is made of: personal connections, kindness, good grace, a sense of community, a sense of place, and an ability to get things done. Canada does need more Prince Edward Island, and the world needs more Canada. Cette perspective basée sur une communauté partagée et une intimité mondiale a été au fond du succès de la conférence sur le changement climatique à Paris en décembre de 2015. Conférence qui a produit la Convention internationale avec l'appui de 195 pays, en effet l'appui du monde entier. On n'aurait pas arrivé à ce consensus sans le leadership du président Obama des États-Unis, ou la Chine, ou les Européennes. Les petits États insulaires ont contribué à une perspective importante et des tracas immédiats. Les peuples indigènes de partout au monde, y compris du Canada, ont joué un rôle critique. The Paris Conference of December 2015 and the accord to reduce greenhouse gases on a global scale stands in contrast to the populism and parochial self-interest that underscores much of our global politics today, not even 3 years later. And that's how fast history can change. We look forward today to the Symons lecture by our good friend, Dr. Margaret MacMillan. While she may not be able to tell us how to turn back the clock or to stop it from turning forward, I'm confident that she will leave us better equipped to understand and make use of our history, and that she may also help us to know better a time a century ago when Canada was small but mighty. Thank you all for being here. Bon après-midi. Merci. Walalia.
Thank you, Honorable Premier. The Symons Medal is named after Professor Thomas H.B. Symons, a great Canadian visionary, educator, and fellow member of the Board of Trust here at the Confederation Centre of the Arts. We are pleased to recognize Professor Symons and his contribution to Canada. And thanks again, Tom, for joining us here today.
Nous sommes enchantés que la célèbre auteure et historienne Margaret MacMillan ait accepté de recevoir la médaille Symons 2018 et de prononcer cette causerie. La causerie de Mme MacMillan a pour titre « Le lionceau, la Première Guerre mondiale et l'évolution de la nation canadienne ».
We will now introduce our 2018 Symons medalist. Margaret MacMillan attended the University of Toronto and studied history. She continued her studies in politics and history at Oxford University, gaining 2 further degrees. She returned to Toronto and for 25 years taught at Ryerson University. It was there that she fell in love with the teaching and presenting history of the highest standard that is accessible to the general public. Her research began with the British Empire, moved to the coming of age of Canada, and more recently has focused on international 20th century history and the nexus of war and peace. As Provost of Trinity College at the University of Toronto, and most recently as Warden at St. Anthony's College at Oxford University, she is an educator of the highest standing. Her literary awards, distinctions, and academic honors are too numerous to list.
Margaret MacMillan est réputée pour de nombreux livres qu'elle a publiés et les nombreuses conférences qu'elle a données. Parmi ses succès littéraires, mentionnons Les Artisans de la paix et comment Lloyd George, Clemenceau et Wilson ont redessiné la carte du monde. Margaret MacMillan a aussi été nommée Compagnon de l'Ordre du Canada. Elle est l'une des 2 Canadiennes qui a été nommée par Sa Majesté la Reine Élisabeth II à l'Ordre des Compagnons d'honneur.
On this, the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, we honor Dr. MacMillan today with our 2018 Symons Medal and look forward to her lecture on Canada's coming of age and the evolution as a nation.
Il nous fait grand plaisir de remettre officiellement la médaille Symons à Mme MacMillan. It's now to give us great pleasure to formally present the Symons Medal to Dr. MacMillan. Please, Dr. MacMillan, join us here on the stage.
I'm fascinated by this. I can put it up, I think. Wait a minute. Isn't it wonderful? I've never seen anything like it before, so congratulations, Charlottetown, for this. I would like to thank very much the Confederation Centre for the Arts and the Symons Committee for giving me this great honor and for inviting me to speak here. And I'd like especially to thank Professor Tom Symons for being Professor Tom Symons and for doing so much for this country. It's a great honor to have a medal in your name. Bonjour à tous. Je parlerai en anglais parce que c'est plus facile pour moi et moins pénible pour vous. Je m'excuse, mais mon français est pas si bon. Forgive me for speaking in English, but it is my first language. My French is very, very rusty at the moment. I want to talk about the Great War and what it meant for Canada. But I think I want to stress that the Great War meant a great deal for the world in general, and it meant a great deal for the countries that were engaged in that war. It changed the relationship and the relationships between Europe and the rest of the world. Before the war started, Europe was the most important part of the world, the most powerful part of the world, the place where you came to if you wanted to borrow money, if you wanted ideas, if you wanted education. And Europeans themselves felt that they were in the forefront, as they would have put it, of civilization. And the Great War was going to change that. Europe was never the same afterwards. It had spent the lives of a great many of its men. We'll never know how many men, largely men in those days, died in the First World War, but one estimate is 9 million. It's a huge number of people who died, and their talents were lost. Their talents of future scientists, the talents of future political leaders, the talents of future artists, all gone on the battlefields in Europe and elsewhere. And the war served to weaken Europe financially, socially, and politically. I think without the First World War, Europe would not have seen its decline in the 1930s and its slide towards the Second World War. The First World War made possible the Second World War. And so we're still living in a world that is created by that great war and by the war that followed. And what the war did for all the societies that fought in it, and many countries fought in it, over 30 countries eventually became part of the First World War. And men came and resources came to sustain that war, not just from Europe, but from around the world. Indo-Chinese came to fight. Chinese came to help dig the trenches. You can still see the graves of the Chinese who died in France, helping the war effort. The Japanese sent ships. The Japanese were an ally in the First World War. Africans came to fight in the war. And of course, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Newfoundlanders, South Africans, Indians came from the British Empire. And so the war was something that touched a great many nations and touched many, many parts of the world. And what the war did in virtually every country that was engaged in it is it brought out social and political tensions, mounting an effort to be in the war, a war that lasted for 4 years, was a tremendous strain on societies. And some didn't survive that strain. Russia had a revolution. The old regime fell to pieces. And I think it is fair to say that without the First World War, we would not have seen the Russian Revolution. We wouldn't have seen the triumph of Bolshevism in Russia. And that was going to have long-term consequences for the rest of the world. Without the First World War, we might have seen a continuation of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that huge multinational empire which sat in the heart of Europe and which had, for better or worse, provided a stability within which people could live, could flourish, could go about their business. Suddenly, that big empire disappeared and a whole number of smaller and quarreling nations took its place. The Ottoman Empire, a huge empire based in Istanbul, which controlled parts of Europe and controlled what is today Turkey and controlled most of the Arab Middle East. It might, too, have survived if it hadn't been for the First World War. And so the war destroyed societies in some cases, and even in the societies which survived it, it brought tremendous strains. In Britain, in France, in Germany, there were tremendous political and social tensions which often erupted into outright confrontation. And that was to be true of Canada as well. We, of course, think of Canada as a very special country, and that is true, and its history has, and its character has unique features. But we also have to remember that Canada is part of a wider world, and that what happened in Canada was in some ways, not all, but in some ways similar to what was happening in other countries. And so what happened in Canada was that the country, and this was paradoxical, both came together in the war effort. The war was an enormously important moment in Confederation for Canada. Our history has been marked by a gradual evolution. We, unlike the United States, or unlike France, or even unlike Britain, or certainly unlike Russia, do not have a single moment where we say this is where it all started. We don't have a single revolutionary moment. We don't have a single act of rebellion against a power that once controlled us. What we have, rather, is a gradual evolution towards responsible government. Confederation, of course, is an enormously important step on that gradual evolution, but so too is the introduction of responsible government earlier on. So too is the gradual freeing of Canada from the British Empire. And so we have had a history which has been marked by, luckily for us, I think, a relatively peaceful evolution towards building a society that works, not always perfectly, but it does work, and towards a country which now runs its own affairs. And so the First World War is a step, and a very important step, in that evolution. During that war, Canadians became more aware of themselves as Canadians, and this was a process that was already happening before the First World War, but it became speeded up during the war, and I think Canadians had a right to feel proud of what they had done in that war. Canadians had a very different concept of who they were by the end of the war than they had had at the beginning. Canada also began to take an increasing role, not just within the British Empire, but in the world. When the war started, Canada's foreign policy was still very much under the control of the British. When Britain declared war, or declared a state of war with Germany, in the summer of 1914, Canada and the rest of the empire were automatically at war. We were not consulted. It was not expected either by us or the British that we would be consulted. By the end of the First World War, however, we expected a great deal more in the way of consultation. And we were increasingly beginning to manage our own foreign affairs. We were dealing directly with the Americans. We were dealing directly with other parts of the empire, such as Australia. And so the First World War makes Canada more, as a diplomat said at the time, more of an international person. We become something more distinctive than we had been at the beginning of the war. But what the war also does for Canada, and it does it for so many other countries as well, is it also serves to divide the nation, because we weren't agreed on how to fight the war. The burdens of the war did not fall equally on everyone. And we had a very serious crisis, which I'll talk about in more detail later on, over the whole issue of conscription. Should young men be conscripted forcibly to go and fight in the Canadian Armed Forces? And the conscription crisis of 1917 and 1918 divided the country very badly and was going to cast a very long shadow over Canadian history, really up into the late 20th century. And so, like other countries in the war, we got a sense of who we were. We had to define ourselves. We had to come together for an international purpose. But we also felt the tensions, which in some countries were going to be even worse and have even worse effects than in this country. I think it's important to remember, and of course we don't remember, any of us now, what it was like in 1914, but we can look back and remember just what a new nation Canada was. And we faced, as other new nations have done, all the challenges of being a new nation. We had to build an infrastructure, and that, of course, was a huge problem in a country the size of ours. Building railways, building ports, simply building the infrastructure which we needed if we were to function as a country was a huge challenge. We had to face, as other newly emerging independent countries have had to face, arguments about the best way to develop ourselves economically. And we faced, as other countries did, economic ups and downs. We had to work out how we wanted to rule ourselves, what sort of government we wanted, what sort of political parties we would have. In many ways, what was happening in Canada before 1914 was very much the same as what was going to happen in newly emerging nations after 1945, nations in Africa or Asia, who had to, again, face the difficulties that come with building independent nations. And we also had to deal with our position within the British Empire. In some ways, it was a beneficial position. We were part of the largest power in the world. and that gave us both a status and a sort of protection. We had always, as we still do today, to think about our great neighbor to the south, and this was something that concerned many Canadians. And there were those in the United States, in those days certainly, who talked about annexing Canada, simply making it part of the greater United States. And this was something that concerned many Canadians, although, as it has always done, it attracted others. The United States has always been something that has both worried us, but also lured us. Many Canadians have gone to the United States. It has always been something that we look to, but it was an issue for us. So what the war did was begin to speed up what had been a gradual definition by Canadians of their position within the British Empire. Even before 1914, we were beginning to see ourselves as a separate people, and people still talk to themselves as subjects of the British Crown. They still talk to themselves as being part of the British Empire. But increasingly, and Australians were doing it too, and New Zealanders were doing it, they were beginning to talk about how we were Canadians who were subjects of the British Crown. We were Canadian members of the British Empire. And there were a number of things that were already happening before 1914 that were helping us to think in this ways. War often played a part in it. We don't have a strong, and I think we're lucky, we don't have a strong military history, although we have participated in many major wars. But we, I think, have never defined ourselves as a military people. But wars have certainly played a very important part in the development of our national consciousness. The South African War of 1899-1902 was a very important step in this. Canada sent troops, volunteer troops, as did Australia and New Zealand. And what is interesting is you began to get Canadian papers and Canadians saying, we are somehow stronger and we're somehow different than the British. And we begin to articulate a difference. Often we're rather condescending towards the British. As one Canadian newspaper said, Canadian troops were grim, solid men as straight as poplars, stronger, in fact, than their British counterparts. And there was a lot of talk about how if you took someone British and transplanted them into Canadian soil, they immediately got bigger and taller and healthier and better at fighting. What you also got in the Canadian commentaries on the South African War was an increasing willingness to criticize the British. I mean, it's part of what happened to Canada was what happens in families. As children grow older, they begin to see their parents in a different way. I mean, when you're very young, you think your parents know everything. And then when you hit about 16, I don't know if any of you here are 16, but you decide your parents don't know anything. And usually when you are about 19, you're amazed at how much they've learned in the meantime. So it is an important process, I think, that we as human beings go through, but countries can also go through, that you begin to realize who you are, and you begin to distinguish yourself from your parents. And this is what was happening in the period before 1914. It was happening in the South African War. And in the Canadian press, you got commentaries criticizing British bungling in South Africa and British incompetence. And there was actually a great deal to criticize. The British did not initially do the war at all well. They thought they could take on a handful, as they saw it, of Afrikaner farmers who wouldn't be able to fight properly, and the Afrikaner farmers fought very well. The British went marching across the Great Plains of South Africa wearing bright red uniforms. And you can imagine what the Afrikaner farmers did. They were all very good shots. They were wearing their usual dust-colored clothes, and they simply lay in the ground and shot the British, which the British found very unsporting. But eventually realized that they had to change. That was when they first began to wear khaki. They began to realize that bright red uniforms in the open aren't a good idea. And so you beget an increased willingness on the part of Canadians to define themselves, to see themselves as, yes, British, but somehow different from the British, and an increased willingness to criticize the British for not actually being very good at what they were meant to do. What they were meant to do was lead the empire and make sure that things worked properly. Stephen Leacock, the great Canadian humorist, wrote an article in an English newspaper in 1907, and he said the British Empire is like a farm. The old man is set in his ways, he doesn't want to change his methods of farming, and the sons are getting restless. The old man's got old, said Leacock, and he don't know it. Winston Churchill, young politician at the time, called it offensive twaddle. But in fact, Leacock was hitting on something very important, that the different components of the British Empire, particularly the so-called Old Dominions, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, and increasingly Newfoundland, were beginning to see themselves very much as senior members of the empire with the right to criticize the British, which is why I gave my lecture the title of The Lion's Cub. There was a very famous Punch cartoon in the period before the First World War, which showed there was a time when the British were engaged in a naval race with Germany and spending a huge amount of money to try and outbuild the Germans. And they were hoping, of course, that the empire would contribute to this effort. And the cartoon shows a rather weary British lion sort of leaning over the edge of a great warship, looking down, and there's a boat filled with very hearty-looking young lion cubs all rowing, and one says Australia, one says Canada, one says New Zealand, and so on. And the idea is that the cubs are coming of age and that they will begin to take a part in the British Empire. Of course, from the Canadian point of view, it wasn't at all clear what that part would be. And increasingly before 1914, you got a debate, a very interesting debate, about what would be the future shape of the British Empire. And increasingly, ideas were coming from the different parts of the empire, not so much from London, although certainly ideas were coming from there. And there really was, I think, a choice, as people saw it at the time, between a much tighter British Empire, which was run as a single big confederation, rather like Confederation in Canada, but on a much larger scale, which would have, and people talked about this, an imperial bureaucracy, an imperial foreign policy, an imperial defense policy, possibly even one day an imperial parliament. And so you would have this huge empire, the biggest empire the world had ever seen, ruled out of a single capital city with a single set of civil servants, with a single defense policy, with a single foreign policy. And that was something that was seriously talked about, and it was becoming more possible thanks to modern communications, thanks to the telegraph, thanks to the steamship. It was possible to imagine keeping the far-flung parts of the British Empire together in a way that it wouldn't have been possible in 100 years earlier. But the Dominions, and this is certainly true in Canada, were in fact ambivalent about this. They weren't sure that they wanted everything directed from London. The Canadians were not sure they trusted London completely to look after Canadian interests. It had been a real shock to Canadians when the British had not backed them over the Alaska Panhandle dispute, this long piece of land that runs down from Alaska towards down the coast of British Columbia, which the Canadians argued should properly belong to them. And the British, who for their own reasons wanted to get on better with the United States, were not prepared to back Canada. And in the end, a three-man tribunal, and the deciding vote was a British vote, awarded the Panhandle to the United States. And so increasingly, examples like that made the Canadians think before the First World War that they couldn't always rely on Britain to think in Canadian interests, that the British, when it came right down to it, would think in the interests of Britain. And so you got a debate that took place in imperial conferences, it took place in the press, it took place among academics, it took place when British and Canadians and others met each other about what the future shape of the empire should be. The Canadians, I think, were increasingly reluctant to be drawn into a very tightly run empire. Their problem, however, was that they didn't actually have much capacity to run their own foreign affairs yet, because everything had been run for them by the British. And that is actually significant. Having the people power, but in those days it was manpower, but we'd say people power today, having the people power to actually run a big complicated institution and to carry out a coherent foreign policy, for example, is actually quite difficult. You can't just grow it quickly. You can't suddenly decide that you want to have a foreign policy when you haven't got anyone who actually knows anything about how to do it. Earl Grey, the Governor General before the First World War, said, and he was being a bit rude but perhaps truthful, only 3 men in the Canadian government service have any knowledge of details connected with Canada's foreign relations. One drinks at times, the other has a difficulty in expressing his thoughts, and conversation with him is as difficult as it is to extract an extra tight cork. And the third is okay. He didn't say okay, but the third is the Undersecretary of State, Pope, a really first-class official. And so when you have a situation when perhaps only one person in Ottawa can actually run a foreign policy for the country, you can understand why Canadians were reluctant to strike out in a way that would place an extra burden on them. But what was going to happen, partly as a result of the First World War and then the peace conference at the end, was a lot more Canadians were going to gain experience. And so by the end of the war, we had a much better sense, not just of what we might want in the world, but actually a much better capacity to do it. Well, the Great War broke out, as you know, in August 1914, And Canada, as I said, was automatically at war. And initially, as far as we know, there were no public opinion polls in those days, but we have a fairly good idea of what people were thinking thanks to the press and thanks to letters to the Prime Minister. Canadians seem to have approved of the decision of the British to go to war. Both British and French speakers, although the divisions were going to come in later, agreed that the invasion of Belgium by German troops was a very bad thing. Belgium was a small neutral country. It had done nothing to provoke Germany. Its problem was that it lay on the way of the German invasion route to France. The Germans attacked Belgium, invaded it, and behaved very badly there. They shot civilians out of hand, they destroyed priceless Belgian cultural artifacts, and they were going to take whatever they could from Belgium in the course of the war. And so I think there was really a feeling in Canada, as there was in Britain, that this was deeply unfair and wrong, and that Germany ought to be stopped. And so, at first, opinion in Canada seems to have been in support of the idea that Canada was now part of a great war effort against Germany and its allies. But even then, there were going to be different levels of enthusiasm among the different peoples in Canada. Those who had British ancestry or had come themselves from Britain, and they made up a majority of the English-speaking population in Canada, were, of course, inclined to support what they saw still as the mother country. And so for them, support of Britain was something that went without question, unless, of course, you came from the Irish part of the British Isles. And then you had a very different view on supporting the mother country. Not all Irish, but certainly there were reservations among some of the Irish. But Canada also had had a lot of immigrants before the First World War from the continent of Europe. Ukrainians, for example, had been encouraged to come to help settle the prairies. And many Ukrainians had family who were fighting for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Some had family who were fighting for Russia, and so it tended to depend. There were also a lot of people from Germany who had moved to Canada, and again, they had mixed feelings about taking up arms against the country from which they had had. And so, although there was an initial enthusiasm in Canada for the war, there were underlying that the possibility of divisions, and those were going to come out later on. Now, the war itself brought tremendous change in Canada. Canada was extremely important in the war effort, partly because it produced soldiers. And the nature of the First World War was that you needed a lot of soldiers. Battles were fought with hundreds of thousands of men. And replacing those men, because the death rate was, of course, very high, replacing those men became absolutely key. If you could not keep your armies in the field, then you ran the risk of defeat. And so as the war settled down into a dreadful stalemate, with attacks which only moved the lines a little bit in the West, keeping those lines filled, keeping those lines supported became absolutely crucial. And so Canadian troops, right from the beginning, were a very important part of the war effort, as were troops from around the Empire. But what also made Canada important was Canada had raw materials. It had food that could be sent to Britain. It had iron ore that could be sent to Britain. And increasingly, Canada had manufacturing. Canada had already been developing its capacity for manufacturing before the First World War, but the First World War was going to speed this up enormously. We began to produce, for example, boats, ships, on a scale that we had never contemplated before the war started. We began to produce weapons. We began to produce the things that were needed in keeping the war effort going. That brought rapid social change. People flocked from the countryside to come and work in the new factories. Increasingly, women got employment, which it had been said before the war they couldn't possibly do. One of the arguments against giving women employment in offices or factories was they simply couldn't get their little heads around it. They couldn't do the sorts of things that men would do. And of course, as manpower became more and more important and scarce, women did begin to move into occupations that had previously been seen as men's. And in Canada, as in Britain and a number of other countries, it was seen by the end of the war that women had shown themselves capable of participating in society and therefore capable of having a vote and in choosing their own representatives. The argument in Canada and elsewhere against women having the vote before the First World War had been twofold. One, that women would always vote the way their husbands or their fathers told them to, and so there was no point giving them the vote because you just have to count twice as many votes and the results wouldn't change. And the second reason was the other one, that women simply didn't have the capacity to think about the great issues of state. You know, they were fine when it came to running the household, but they couldn't do these big issues about should we go to war or not. And that clearly didn't make much sense by the end of the war. And so women got the vote in all provinces except Quebec, where they weren't going to get it till much later. And federally, women had the vote in 1918. And there were other changes that came as a result of the war. Labor unions grew. Labor became much more important, and so you got bigger and often more militant labor unions. Governments also discovered, in Canada and elsewhere, that they could get a lot more resources out of society than they had ever expected. Governments had always assumed that you couldn't really tax people too heavily because the economy would simply come to a halt. And then they found during the war that in fact they could tax, and they could keep on taxing, and in fact the economy didn't come to a halt. And so you did have a pressure for social change, economic change in Canada. The war really speeded up developments that were probably already happening. What was also happening, of course, and this was what was to really put Confederation under tremendous strain, was that the French speakers in Canada, particularly those in Quebec, were becoming increasingly unhappy with the war. And I think there were a number of reasons for that. They were feeling marginalized already before the war started. In 1912, Regulation 17 in Ontario cut back on French education in schools. I don't think the present Premier of Ontario reads much history, but who knows, he may be thinking back to this Regulation 17. And it was seen by French speakers as a slap and a betrayal of French language rights. During the war, a new newspaper in Ottawa, Le Droit, asked, "What use is it for us to fight Prussianism," which is often how they describe Germany, "and barbarity when the same conditions exist at home?" The French who were going into the armed forces, and the armed forces were entirely volunteer until the conscription crisis, a number of French went into the armed forces, but they felt that they were not being treated as full members of the armed forces. They often had English-speaking officers. There seems to have been little attempt made to give them French-speaking officers, and so there was an unhappiness being expressed with the way in which the French speakers were being treated. And those divisions were going to become more pronounced as the war went on. They were both linguistic, but they were also often Catholic versus Protestants. Religious and geographic differences began to overlap with linguistic differences. And the political parties, liberals and conservatives, which had done so much to bridge those divides before the war, which had really been national parties and had helped to bring the country together, now began to divide on linguistic, religious, and geographical lines. And that all came to a head, of course, with the conscription crisis of 1917. Prime Minister Borden, a conservative prime minister, had always promised, as he said in a speech in Halifax in December 1914, there has not been, there will not be compulsion or conscription. Yet he was beginning to feel pressure from his own generals and from the British for manpower, this absolutely crucial element in the war effort. And in 1916, he promised an army of 500,000 men, which was very optimistic. This was a country of some 8 million people, and getting a volunteer army of 500,000 men was probably impossible. There was great resistance, not just among French speakers in Quebec. It's often been unfairly said it was only the French speakers who resisted conscription. There was also great resistance to conscription in the countryside. Farmers, for obvious reasons, didn't want their sons, whose labor was important to the health and prosperity of the family farm, going off to fight. They didn't want to lose that. And so there was resistance throughout Canada, but a lot of it concentrated in Quebec to any talk of conscription. Borden himself became convinced that it was going to be necessary, even though he saw the political downside of it. In March 1917, he visited the United Kingdom, and he talked to the British about the desperate need for more people to fight. And he visited wounded Canadian soldiers, and he became convinced that conscription was going to be necessary. And so in May 1917, he announced that all citizens are liable for the defense of their country. And he went on and said, "I conceive that the battle for Canadian liberty and autonomy is being fought on the plains of France and Belgium." And so this was something that he now saw as absolutely essential for the defense of Canada. It came, of course, after the great and successful Canadian attack at Vimy Ridge, but that attack cost 10,000 casualties, men killed, wounded, or missing, and this, in the context of the Canadian Armed Forces, was absolutely huge. And so in June 1917, he introduced the Military Service Act, and Parliament and the country began to split along linguistic lines. The summer that followed was one of unrest in Montreal, but also in other cities and towns in Quebec. There was a feeling among French-Canadian elites that Borden had broken his promise. The Archbishop of Montreal, who was by no means a fiery-eyed radical, wrote to Borden, "Dear Sir Robert, do you not think, in light of our population, that we have largely done our share? The people are agitated. In the province of Quebec, we can expect deplorable revolts. Will this not end in bloodshed?" And it was a very good question to ask because it was going to end in bloodshed. And Wilfrid Laurier, who had supported the war effort but had refused to join the war cabinet, said to Borden again, "Is it not true that the main reason advocated for conscription, not so much publicly as privately, not shouted but whispered, is that Quebec must be made to do her part and French Canadians forced to enlist compulsorily, since they do not enlist voluntarily?" And in the street demonstrations that followed, increasingly younger and more radical leaders took over. They sometimes attacked business and war profits as well. They sometimes included Anglophone labor leaders and radicals, and increasingly moderate French leaders who were trying to keep things from spiraling into open confrontation were attacked. In August 1917, a bomb blew up part of the country house of Lord Athelstan, who owned the conservative Montreal Daily Star. And increasingly, the radical speakers who were out in the streets and in the parks in Montreal and elsewhere were threatening open war and revolution. They marched with banners saying, "À bas nos Boches," down with our own Germans. And the government cracked down. The police came out, and there were often pitched battles in the streets. The election of December 1917 was won by Borden and his conservative unionists. It included pro-conscription English liberals, and there was, I think, a bit of chicanery here. Wartime Elections Act disenfranchised all immigrants who had come post-1900. It was a way of ensuring that the vote came out the way that Borden and his unionists wanted. The Liberals did get votes in Quebec. They took 62, the Liberals who were not supporting the conscription, Liberals got 62 out of the 65 Quebec seats. And for the next generations, Quebec was not going to elect many Conservatives at all. The only Unionists, that is the Conservative plus Liberals who supported the Conservatives, the only seats they got in Quebec were 3, and they were in predominantly English-speaking districts. And so the splits in the country now become very open indeed. In Easter 1918, rioters in Quebec City come out, the troops are called, and charge the rioters. 4 killed, many are injured. And this is going to have very long-term consequences. It is going to cast a shadow well into, as I say, the 20th century. It's going to be one of the reasons that the Conservatives had such trouble getting a foothold in Quebec for so long. It's going to be one of the reasons that Quebec nationalism became so powerful. They now had another humiliation and another grievance to add to a rather longer list. And it was one of the reasons why Mackenzie King, the Canadian Prime Minister in the Second World War, moved so cautiously when it came to the issue of conscription, because it was something that had come so close to really dividing the country once and for all. At the same time as this was happening, as the country was feeling the strains of the war effort, of course, what was happening elsewhere was that Canada, at least internationally and in its own conception of itself, was becoming much more defined and much clearer about what it was. Canadians, by the end of the war, were very well aware of the contribution that they had made to the war effort through their men, but also through their resources. And when it came to the Canadian forces in France, the Canadians were very firm, and this was something that was certainly at the governmental level, but also supported by public opinion, that Canadians be in a Canadian corps, that they be commanded by Canadian officers, that they always be kept together. British officers frequently complained that the Canadians weren't willing to move their troops around, that the Canadians insisted that they be kept together and be treated as a separate unit. But it was important for Canadians, and it was important that Canadians helped to win victories. And Vimy Ridge we see now as a very important moment in creating a Canadian national consciousness. We have, as nations will do, slightly simplified the history. In fact, the overall general commanding was a British general, although Sir Arthur Currie, the Canadian general, was very much part of the effort, and a great many British troops also took part in the attack on Vimy Ridge. But Vimy Ridge became for us a Canadian victory, a signal that Canada had arrived on the world stage and we knew how to do things properly. And certainly the British noticed that the Canadians were developing a real feeling of being Canadians. As one British officer said, the Canadian Corps was an organization. It had life. There was a family feeling present. And this, I think, was important for Canadians, so that while we were having divisions at home, we nevertheless are building some sort of shared Canadian identity and feeling abroad. And we're also becoming, as a people, very different in our attitude towards the British. Before the First World War, we still looked on the British, in spite of our propensity to be critical, we still looked at the British as people who knew better. I mean, they were the big power. And when Canadians were ambitious, if they wanted education, if they wanted to make a mark, they tended to go to London, much as they might go to New York or Los Angeles today. But London was the center of the Canadian world, and we assumed that the British knew best. We assumed that the British were wiser, even when they did make mistakes, that they were more efficient, and that they had a better sense of what they were doing. At the beginning of the war, Sir Robert Borden, our Prime Minister, writes really very politely and rather humbly to the British government through his High Commissioner in London. He says, would you mind just letting me know what the British government is thinking of doing? It might be helpful. By 1917, he's banging his fist on the table, almost literally, but certainly metaphorically, saying this is not good enough, I demand this, I demand that, I want to know what's going on, I want to understand what you're doing, I don't think you're doing things in the right way. And there's a very important psychological shift, I think, where we become prepared to criticize the British and we become prepared to assert our own views. In 1916, Borden writes a very famous letter in which he says, Canadians are being treated like toy automata. We're being treated as if we don't count. We're being treated like little wind-up toys. And then he gives a list of what he thinks the British are up to. Procrastination, indecision, inertia, doubt, hesitation, and many other undesirable qualities have made themselves all too conspicuous in this war. Later on in 1918, he has a discussion with General Currie, the great Canadian general, and says, Currie has convinced me, and I'll quote again, of the incompetence and blundering stupidity of the whiskey and soda British headquarters staff. Now, this is a very, very different tone. And he becomes, and as Australia is doing it too, becomes increasingly critical of the British offensives, the quality of the British generals, and he demands that Canada share in the making of strategy for the war and the making of policy for the war. And as the war begins to come to an end, he demands also that Canada share in the making of the peace. The British are more willing to listen by the end of 1916 because they've had a change in government. Henry Asquith, who had been Prime Minister, had been ousted, and a new Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, had come in, who was radical, efficient, and prepared to wage the war to the end, and prepared to and determined to win it. And Lloyd George understood, as Asquith had never understood, that he had to work with the Dominions, that he simply could not take them for granted. He couldn't treat them as if they were a bunch of bumbling colonials who didn't know what was what. And so Lloyd George set up what was an innovation, an Imperial War Cabinet, which was to include a representative of the Empire, and there were to be regular consultations with Empire statesmen. And so, although it was difficult, Borden went to England in 1917 and 1918. Billy Hughes came from Australia, very difficult and also dangerous voyage to get there because of the danger of U-boat warfare. And increasingly, what Borden and others are demanding is not just a say in the war, but a change in the whole relationship of the components of the empire to each other. Borden wrote to Lloyd George in 1917, saying, the Dominions have fought in this war upon the principle of equal nationhood. We must have, when the war is over, said Borden, a special meeting to readjust the constitutional relations of the empire, based upon a full recognition of the Dominions as autonomous nations of an imperial commonwealth, and the term commonwealth now begins to be used for the first time rather than empire. It implies much more of a free association of peoples. And so you get, by 1918, when the war finally comes to an end, a very altered relationship between the British and the Canadians. The Australians are much the same, but it really is the Canadians who see themselves very much as the senior of the Dominions, which we were and still are. We see themselves very much as taking the lead in this. And I think increasingly we are coming to see Europe as something that is rather old-fashioned, has made rather a mess of its own affairs. Canadian diplomats who go, we now have some diplomats and very competent ones, who go to the Paris Peace Conference which starts in 1919, thinks that the Europeans really need some advice from the New World. As Loring Christie, who's one of our really important early diplomats, says, America will let Europe stew in its own juice if Europe doesn't recognize that it's getting very good advice. John Defoe, who was owner and proprietor of the Winnipeg Free Press and in charge of press relations at the Peace Conference, said to an audience once in Canada, his chief impression from the time he was in Paris at the Peace Conference was that he was glad he was separated from Europe by the Atlantic Ocean. And so you're beginning to get, I think, a really important, and it comes out very much at the Peace Conference. The Peace Conference meets in Paris in 1919, January 1919, and what it is meant to be is a preliminary meeting. It's meant to be a meeting of all those on the winning side, who number well over 30 nations, and they are meant to come up with the peace terms they're going to offer to the defeated. And clearly the most important set of peace terms are the ones to Germany, because Germany was the linchpin, the center of the enemy in the First World War, but it was also still the most powerful country left standing. Austria-Hungary had disappeared. There was no point talking to Austria-Hungary. It no longer existed. The Ottoman Empire was about to go, and Bulgaria really didn't count much on the international stage. And so it was Germany that they had to think about. And the idea was they'd come up with the peace terms, then they would call the defeated nations, and they'd sit around a table and have a negotiation, which is what had always happened at peace conferences in the past. It took them so long to get the terms agreed upon. Took them until May 1919, and it very nearly resulted in the whole peace conference blowing up. Italy walked out, Japan threatened to walk out, China threatened to walk out, Belgium threatened to walk out. I mean, it was very, very acrimonious that they couldn't do that. And so they simply called the defeated nations and said, here are your terms, take them or leave them. We don't have time to negotiate. The Canadians were part of that process, and the Canadians were there right from the beginning. Borden arrived in London in November 1918, fully intending to go to the peace conference, and he found, to his fury, that the British intended to represent the whole empire on their own. They weren't going to invite Borden along, they weren't going to invite Australia along, they weren't going to invite anyone else along. And Borden said, I'm going home. He said, I'm out of here unless you make Canada full participant in the peace conference. And so when the British went to Paris, they went not as Britain, they went as the British Empire delegation. And that, I think, was a very important symbol of the way in which the relationship had changed. And they had to listen to their empire representatives. The British Empire delegation met 35 times between January and June, and Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, came, or if he couldn't come, he sent his Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, and they had to answer questions, and they had to listen to debates. They're what diplomats call full and frank discussions, often very cross, often very angry, but the Dominions now are putting their own point of view, and they are sometimes pushing the British in directions the British don't want to go. For example, the British didn't really want to get into an argument with the United States over the fate of Germany's colonies. Woodrow Wilson, the American president, had made it very clear that he didn't think colonies should be handed out as prizes, that they should be administered by his new League of Nations instead. And the Australians wanted colonies, South Africa wanted colonies. The British did not want to argue with the US about this, but they found themselves having to do it. They had to stand up on behalf of their own members of the empire. The Canadians play a very interesting role, as we've often done internationally. We try and bring both sides together. We try and find an agreement. We try and find a compromise. And so the Canadians at Paris, on the whole, I think, play a very constructive role. They act as intermediaries. They will go around, Borden and others will go around and talk to people who are quarreling and see if they can get some sort of agreement. The Canadians certainly don't work on behalf of the British. They really work on behalf of international harmony and international agreement. There is a further argument in Paris over the new League of Nations. The British say, well, we'll join and represent you all. And the Canadians say no, and so do the Australians. And so Canada joins the League of Nations on its own as a country. There is a final, and now perhaps seemingly to us a rather trivial argument over who's actually going to sign the treaty. And the British say, well, we'll sign it on behalf of you all. And again, the Canadians say no. And so there's rather a long argument, which I'll spare you the details. But in the end, the British Prime Minister signs it, and then indented, the Canadians sign, the Australians sign, the South Africans sign. But we make a point. And we make a point that we have to ratify it. It does not become legal till it's gone through the Canadian Parliament. And so it's a different Canada. It's a Canada that has been badly battered by the war, but it's a Canada that has also gained a sense of itself. And so the impact of the First World War, I think, on Confederation is both good and bad. It gives us more sense of who we are, but it also really divides the country in ways which I think were very, very dangerous to the future of Confederation. I think we're lucky we survived that very difficult period. We moved more and more to full independence, and we took over our own external affairs, as we called them in those days. And we tended, but it was more, of course, in English-speaking Canada than perhaps in Quebec, we tended to remember the war as something that was the moment when Canadians became Canadian. Vimy Ridge became one of our great national unifying stories. We were content to be colonials, said one of the Canadians who fought at Vimy Ridge, but afterwards we were Canadians. Frank Underhill, who had fought there, who later became a great academic, great constitutional expert, wrote to his mother in September 1917 from the battlefronts in France, "I'm much more of a Canadian now than I ever was." And I think that has become part of our national story. We don't always know how to commemorate it, and I think the recent commemorations that took place of the First World War in Canada were perhaps more muted than in some other countries. In Britain, they had full-on commemorations of virtually every moment of the war, and the same thing in Australia. I think for us, we remember the war with pride, but we also remember it perhaps as a time when Confederation was shaken and when this country very nearly came apart. But we're still here, and I think that is the great strength of Confederation. We have somehow set up and agreed upon a system that is elastic enough that we can have our disagreements, but so far those disagreements have not shattered what was, when you think of it, a very improbable arrangement. If you had been taking bets on Canada in 1867, you'd have said it won't work. It's too big, it's too unworkable, its population is too small, and as Canada grew enormously in the years after Confederation, I think you would have been forgiven for being even more pessimistic, that it is an unworkable country. I sometimes talk to people who say, you know, countries like Iraq and many countries in Africa have artificial boundaries. Look at the lines, they're all very straight. No wonder they don't work. Well, for some reason we've managed to make very straight boundaries work. We're an improbable country in many ways, but here we still are. Thank you.
It's now my great pleasure to invite Dr. Ed MacDonald to the podium to thank our 2018 Symons medalist. Dr. MacDonald is a professor of history at the University of Prince Edward Island, where since the year 2000 has taught Canadian, Atlantic, and PEI history.
De 2015 à 2018, il a été le président du département d'histoire et des études classiques. Le professeur MacDonald a fait ses études à l'Université de l'île du Prince-Édouard et à l'Université Queen's. Il a également été rédacteur en chef de The Island Magazine et commissaire d'histoire au musée et à la Fondation du patrimoine de la province, puis directeur de la recherche à l'Institut d'études de l'île.
Author of several books on social, political, and environmental history of PEI, he was the recipient of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, Heritage Canada's Lieutenant Governor's Award, and the Boyd Beck Memorial Award for contributions to the preservation of island heritage, just to name a few. Please join us in welcoming Dr. MacDonald to the stage.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor for me to be asked to thank and to respond to a world-class talk by a world-class scholar. So let's begin with that. It combines sweeping kind of grasp of both our history and world history. It looks at, which many of us don't do, the things that are happening outside of our country and the things happening inside our country. So my response is going to take the form of a sermon followed by a lesson. First, the sermon. You've heard the saying, "I'm history." I'm finished is what that means. Done. I'm dismissed. The past. Well, in recent times, it seems to me that a common attitude towards history is just that it is simply the past. And what does it matter? It has become to the society what it's become in many of our high schools, which is an elective. And very often it's not elected. So history, the study of the past, by many of us has become an irrelevance in a world consumed by the present. An individual recently who ran for the leadership of a party in Canada termed it a luxury. It's all right for those who already have a living in the world. Our lecture today, a vivid lecture, an erudite lecture, is a reminder that history should instead be a necessity. For the past is a road of cause and effect, and it leads really to the present. It leads, I think, inexorably to the present. And if we're going to understand how we got to now, to here, we need to find that road, to travel it. Let me put it another way. People tend to think of history as a dry excavation of the past deeds. You find it, you put it on display, and you let it sit there and you'll gather dust. But history is the key to understanding. And understanding is the beginning of wisdom. And I think that wisdom should be the impetus of action. So history should be our teacher. Too often it's our servant. Our speaker has written of this, and I think our premier actually mentioned it. When we're not ignoring history, there are people who use it to rationalize or justify a decision that they've already made or an action they've taken. But history is linked with understanding, is linked to wisdom. Today, our speaker gave us the gift of that wisdom, of her wisdom, seated in a broad kind of expertise and insight, a wisdom that enables us to see what was happening in our country within a larger space, context in geography and time. So on your behalf, I want to thank her for that gift. Now for the lesson. I'm an historian of place, and the place is the province that we live in. And I thought perhaps that I would share as a supplement, as an addendum, as a sidebar to our lecture from Dr. MacMillan, something of the island's experience of the Great War and its effect on ourselves, on the sense we had of ourselves. Canada in 1914, to my mind, was like one of those, kind of like a doll, a Russian doll, where you open up the first doll, and inside there's a smaller doll, and inside that there's yet another doll. So there was one doll, that was our country, but there were all these other dolls, self-contained and complete unto themselves. And the smallest doll of them all was Prince Edward Island. In many ways, we were a self-contained world. We were insulated from and occasionally isolated from the mainland. And as every island school child knows, or should know, we were reluctant entrants into the Union of Canada, the Confederation. And on the eve of World War I, we had increasingly chafed within that Confederation. As the country expanded, filling in the West and the North, our world contracted. We felt marginalized and neglected. Alone among all the provinces, the population of our island declined during this era. Our population was going down, all of our youth were leaving. In 1908, The Guardian launched a campaign for settlement of our problems with the rest of the country or separation. Now, the campaign didn't go that far. By 1914, we'd gotten over that somewhat. We discovered the touristic advantage of being the cradle of Confederation. And so we even planned a big event to make that point to the rest of the country. We're the cradle of the Confederation. We're going to have a celebration. And then the Great War happened, and everything had to be canceled. Our experience of the Great War was a trial by fire, as it was for the rest of the country. And some of that fire came from other parts of Canada. In all, just under 4,000 islanders enlisted on Prince Edward Island to serve in the Great War. The percentage was the second lowest in the country. It was higher only than Quebec. And the press and the rest of the country now and then would turn their guns on us and complain about our patriotism. Of course, when you think of it, the people most likely to enlist in World War I were recent immigrants from the British Isles who were living in a city and were out of work. We had no one like that. In fact, when you include the people born on Prince Edward Island who enlisted elsewhere in the country, over 7,100 islanders enlisted in World War I, including scores of nurses. They were caught up in the maelstrom of war. 500 of them or so lost their lives. War changed them. It changed our province. The war drew us more fully into Canada. Shared sacrifice, shared loss, and victory. It didn't solve all of our issues with the rest of the country. But even as it helped make us more of a nation, it helped islanders feel more fully Canadian. Who we were in the years that came afterwards, what we became, and who we are now is very much a function of that anvil of war. And so, what can we say to thank our speaker for the gift of the wisdom and knowledge that she possesses? I think our thanks can be an attitude as we leave this hall. Most of you are aware of the common quote that those who ignore their past are condemned to repeat it, misquote it. That, in fact, is a misquote of the actual words, but it sounds better. Well, as historians, we shy away from that statement because history does not, in fact, actually repeat itself. No two ages, situations, or societies in the laboratory of our history are ever exactly the same. The Gilded Age of the late 1800s was not the same as the Gilded Age of the 1900s. The decline of the Republic in Rome is not the analog for the America of the current time, although the similarities are striking. But if we ignore history, if we do not take the journey, and it can be a difficult journey, from the past to the present, in order to gain the understanding and the judgment, then we will be as easily led as the sheep on my tie. Friends and colleagues, let us not be sheep.
Merci, Professeur MacDonald, pour vos propos éclairés sur la causerie de Margaret MacMillan. En tant qu'insulaires et que Canadiens, nous sommes très reconnaissants envers vos contributions à ces importantes discussions sur le patrimoine et sa commémoration.
I now invite members of our audience to ask a few questions of Dr. MacMillan, moderated by Ed MacDonald. So if anyone's interested in asking questions, please approach one of the microphones. You'll see them coming down the aisle here, and we'll let Ed take over from here.
First thing is to make sure that the mic is on. Thank you for your patience. Time for us to hear from you. So we have a couple of mics here, and our speaker graciously has provided us with some time, 15 or 20 minutes. And Fraser, do we have our first?
We do.
We have a question.
Hi, my name is June Horn, and my question is, why did you start learning about all this history?
That's a very good question, and I'm not sure when I started, but I think it was because when I was young, I used to love to listen to stories that my mother told me, my father told me, my grandmother told me, about what it was like when they were young. And they gave me a sense that the world had been a different place, that my grandmother, for example, told me that when she was a little girl, she lived in North Wales, which was a very pretty part of the British Isles, but there weren't any cars. And if they wanted to go anywhere, they had to go by pony cart, or they had to walk. And so it got me interested. I thought how different it was. And my Canadian grandfather grew up on a farm, which his ancestors, his grandparents had got, and it had been covered with trees. They were given some land, but they got there and it was covered with trees, so they had to cut the trees down and make a farm. And he told us stories about that, and he told us that he used to walk, he probably exaggerated, people often do when they get older, and he said, you know, you're all so lazy, your generation, we had to walk 4 miles to school every day and 4 miles back. And they were farm boys, and they hated wearing shoes, and so they'd hide their shoes in the ditch when they left the house, and then they'd walk to school barefoot. And he told us, I've never forgotten it, he said one day when we were in school it snowed, and we had to walk all the way back 4 miles in our bare feet. And he said after that we always wore our shoes. So you learn, ask your parents and your grandparents. I think you get a sense of the past and how things have changed. And I think I was just fascinated by this, and I wanted to know what it was like. What did people eat? What did children like me wear? What sort of toys did they play with? And so I think I grew up always being interested in history. And there's some wonderful books for children you can read, and then as you get older you read more grown-up books, which are very good about what it was like. And the past is many things, but it's lots and lots of stories. And that's what I find fascinating. And there's always more to learn. You never get bored with it. You don't think, oh, I now know the past, because there's always another bit. So, but thank you for that question, because I've thought about it a lot, and I think it started early on. So maybe you'll get the bug. Be careful.
I should add here, too, that our speaker today, Dr. MacMillan, has a rare gift for an historian in that she writes scholarship in a language we can all understand for a wider readership.
That's very nice of you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So we have a question over here.
Hello, Dr. MacMillan. My name's Kathy Large. I'm interested in your thinking about why Confederation did survive the conscription crisis. You talked about it being elastic, but is there anything else you can mention that would help us understand why this form of government has helped us?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's a really important question about our country, and I don't think I know an answer. I mean, I think possibly the conscription crisis scared people in both communities. I mean, the elites in Quebec, the French-speaking elites, I think, became increasingly worried that the street demonstrations were being taken over by more and more radical elements, and I think that was important. I mean, I think they were prepared to go so far and no further. I think it also helped that the war ended before a great many conscripted troops could be trained and sent overseas. If it had continued, I think it might have been a different question. What I think has often helped to keep this country together, I mean, you know, history is used often in nationalist movements, and a sort of history that was certainly used in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when French separatism was at its height in Quebec, was of a repeated set of humiliations and setbacks at the hands of the English speakers. And that history, I don't think, reflects the true history of Canada. I mean, this country has been built on cooperation, and more than cooperation, interchange, including personal, I mean, people marrying into each other's communities. And I think that has helped to hold the country together. I mean, we certainly have seen separations between the English and French speakers, but we've also seen a lot of cooperation. I mean, Confederation wouldn't have been possible without cooperation between French and English speakers, without cooperation between Quebec and Ontario, Upper and Lower Canada. And so I think possibly we've always pulled back. I think we've recognized that there is something to be gained in hanging together, even if we squabble. And I think it also helps that we have a United States to the south of us. You know, that has helped us to realize that we probably are better off together. And that was the argument that Pierre Trudeau always made when he was dealing with French separatists. He said the French nation is more secure inside a strong Canada than it would be as a little French-speaking independent nation in a large sea of English speakers in North America. So it may be a mixture of pragmatism, our willingness to cooperate and come to terms with each other, and a sense that we may not always get on well, but we're better off together than the alternative. But I think the conscription crisis was probably, except for the crisis of the 1990s, the most serious crisis this country ever faced. And I think we were lucky in a way that we muddled through it.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a question on this side.
Hello, my name is Amanda. I'm a student from Holland College. I study journalism. And my question is, do you think it's important that a political leader of the nation should know history?
Thank you. I think it is important. I mean, I think it's important for us all to know history because it's about, we're made by our histories in a way. You know, we are independent people, we make our own lives, but we grow up in worlds which others have made for us, and we grow up in communities which others have made for us, and how that came about, I think, helps us to understand who we are. And I think it helps us to understand other people as well. You know, you have memories, your friends have memories, and the more you understand about each other, what each of you is remembering, the more you're likely to sort of be able to get on with each other. And so if you want to understand a people you're dealing with or an individual you're dealing with, the more you know about them, where they're coming from, perhaps the better chance you have of getting on with them. I think, you know, people are the same, but they're not the same. You know, we have different sets of values, we have different ways of looking at the world, we have different attitudes. And I think we need to understand that. And so if you want to understand why there is what seems like an insoluble, not capable of being solved conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, I think it's important to understand what history each comes out of and what history each is remembering, and they're remembering very different histories. I think history can also be helpful in sometimes telling us, you know, reminding us that we tell ourselves stories which aren't always true. You know, I often say to people when I'm lecturing around the world, you know, Canadians have a story about themselves that we are very nice and gentle people and never say boo to anyone. And I say to audiences around the world, have you ever seen a Canadian hockey game? Yeah. So, you know, we need to be aware of ourselves as well. So I think history is important. And I think the final reason it's important is that it helps us to ask good questions. It won't predict the future, but it will help us to say, look, if we have a crisis at the moment, what is likely to happen? Or if you had been the leaders of the United States or Britain when they were deciding to invade and occupy Iraq in the 2000s, if those leaders had said to themselves, which they didn't, how are the people in Iraq likely to react if we come in? How did they react before when people invaded them? That might have made them take a second breath and think, wait a minute, we better not do this. So I think history is important. I mean, there are many ways of understanding the world, but history is certainly an important way.
Thank you.
And now we come back over to the other side. Thank you for balancing things off.
My name is Dominic Arsenault, and I was wondering if you could speak briefly, because I know this is a large topic, to what the First World War and Canada's emergence as a post-colony meant for Indigenous peoples in Canada.
Well, the record there, as is so often, I think, is mixed. We expected and encouraged Indigenous peoples to enlist. And some of you may have read that wonderful, I think, wonderful novel by Joseph Boynton, The 3-Day Road, which was based on what actually happened, that you had extremely skilled Indian First Nations Indigenous sharpshooters, and they did participate in the war effort, but when they came back, they were still treated as second-class citizens. And that seems to me very typical of our relationship with our Indigenous peoples, that we're prepared to call upon them at certain times, and then we're prepared to ignore them or simply marginalize them at others. And so I don't think the First World War was a great step forward for a better understanding of the role of Indigenous peoples in our society, or for giving Indigenous peoples a greater role in our society. We used the Indigenous, we encouraged the Indigenous when we needed them, and I say we, meaning the majority society, and then we let things go back to the ways in which they had been afterwards.
And back over to this side.
Hello, my name is Christian Hansen. My question was, historically, especially World War I and after, it seems that Canada tends to pick a big friend, in the first case the British, and then later on in the US, and then we're very chummy, and then over time the relationship deteriorates. Is there something about Canada that just seems that we find a big ally to be friends with, and then slowly the relationship deteriorates till we find another?
Yeah. I don't think I entirely agree with you. We don't pick them, they pick us. And I don't mean that flippantly. I mean, we were a set of colonies of the British, and a former French colony. And so we didn't really have much choice in it. We were established as offshoots of European societies, and the British ended up, thanks to the 7 Years' War, being the people who dominated the Canadian colonies. And so we had to, I think those who lived there initially had no sense of independence. They were too small in number, they were dealing with too many other things, and in fact being part of the British Empire was a form of protection. And I think what it did do for us is give us an enduring willingness and capacity to work multilaterally. We have always worked with others. We've always had to. We've always been part of larger groupings. There's at no time in Canadian history that, that's an exaggeration. I mean, there was some talk in the 1960s and 70s about Canada following the Finland model and being an independent, neutral nation, as if this would somehow give us greater freedom in the world. It didn't look very closely at the Finnish model. The Finns are neutral, but they have to do very much what the Soviet Union and now Russia wants in foreign policy. And I think it's just a recognition that we are a small people, in spite of occupying this huge landmass, and we have to get on with other powers, or the alternative would be ostracization. I mean, it would be, and I don't think we'd be left alone. I mean, if we had followed the Cuban path and decided to fall out with the United States and adopt a very different political and social and economic system, I don't think the United States would have left us alone in the same way that they eventually left Cuba alone. Cuba was small and unimportant, but we are big and important, and we have to get on with the United States. But one of the reasons I think that we have always been very keen on multilateral, we've always been keen, I think, on multilateral organizations. We were great supporters of the League of Nations. We are great supporters of the United Nations. We were one of the founding members of NATO. I mean, we've always seen our national interest lying in being part of larger groupings. It, to us, has given us both protection but also a voice. And I think that's important. And as far as the United States is concerned, You know, I think, again, Pierre Trudeau had it right. I mean, we are in bed with an elephant, and there's not much we can do about it except try and protect ourselves as best we can and try and influence them. But it has, I think, made us perhaps among nations more willing to work with others and understanding the value of compromise. I don't think we have a lot of choice, or the choices are very unpalatable. The alternatives to doing that are very unpalatable. So.
And back to this side. Sir?
Hello, my name is Cole Lalonde. I'm also a member of the journalism program at Holland College. My question refers to the Premier's comments earlier about populism. I'm not sure if you know much about Brazil, but I was wondering, what do you think in its current leadership and the rise of populism there and far-right fascism led to that, in your opinion, and how would you go about preventing something like that happening elsewhere?
Well, populism, I think, is based on usually, very real grievances. And in the case of Brazil, they have had a history of corrupt and incompetent governments and a lack of services. I mean, ordinary people in Brazil, it depends where you live, but if you live in Rio, if you live in Sao Paulo, and a number of the other big metropolises, you can't send your children to school safely. You have to worry about that. You can't travel on the buses without worrying about being mugged. You can't go about your ordinary life. And there's been a breakdown of law and order, and the state is simply failing to deliver the things that people expect from it. I mean, there's a growing middle class in Brazil, and I think they've become increasingly impatient with what they see as the failures of the state. And it's not just normal, I think security is enormously important. If you don't have security of your person and your property and those of your family, then you can't do much else. But it's also feeling that the government is lagging on building infrastructure, that too many contracts have seen money being drained off to the cronies and so on. And the Lula government was meant to be a breath of fresh air, and it turned out not to be. I mean, the levels of corruption in that government and its successor were absolutely appalling. And so the new president of Brazil was riding a wave of very real public anger. And I think that's true of populist movements elsewhere. I mean, they often tap into very real public grievances. The trouble with populist movements, and I really would make a distinction between populists and protest. I mean, you can have protest parties like the Greens, who have a cause, are prepared to protest about it, but also prepared to work within the system. Populist parties, it seems to me, at least the way I define them, are dangerous in two ways. One, that they claim to speak for this mythical entity called the people. And we talk for the people. I mean, the Cinque Stelle in Italy do it. We are talking for the real people. Trump does it. I'm talking for the real Americans. What that means is they're defining who are the real people. And if you disagree with them, well, you're not one of the real people and you don't deserve to be treated in a respectful way. And that leads me to my second point, is I think populist parties of that nature, and they can be left or right, I mean, I think the political ideology actually doesn't matter all that much, are about, they don't respect democracy. They're about using the institutions of democracy, in effect, to undermine it. They have no respect for the idea of a reasoned opposition. If you disagree with them, you are against the people. And that seems to me very dangerous. I mean, they're about excluding, and they often have racist and chauvinistic overtones. You know, in Hungary, the present government is talking increasingly, but it's been talking for years now, about how it is a Christian government. It's representing a Christian Hungary, and anyone who's not Christian doesn't belong. And increasingly, it's using absolutely grotesque anti-Semitic attacks on George Soros. And I was in Budapest recently, and the posters up of Soros, which looked like they could have come from Nazi Germany, you know, the greedy Jew destroying Hungarian civilization. And so I think populist parties are very dangerous. I think it's fine to protest. There are lots of things to protest about. But it's the shape those protests take and the ways in which people use those protests which makes them very dangerous indeed.
Thank you.
Fraser, we have time for a couple more, or just one more? Nick?
Thank you, Dr. MacMillan, for that riveting talk. My name is Nick Scott, and I'm a history student at UPI. Hi, Dr. MacMillan.
Hello.
Oh, sorry, Dr. MacDonald as well.
Oh.
It's all the mechs.
Yeah.
So I am also studying the British Empire and the Canadian nation as it emerged. And I was wondering, when we talk about the Canadian nation in this early stages, it was self-described, obviously, by a lot of politicians of that period as a white man's country. And I was wondering, to what extent can we make moral judgments of history when we're studying it, and how does that contribute to our understanding of history?
I find that very tricky. It's a good question. I mean, I think we are, as individuals, entitled to make moral judgments about anything, and we may get them right or we may get them wrong. I'm not sure it is the role of historians to go through the past awarding gold stars and black ticks. I think we've got to try and understand the past. And I think if we are trying to judge the past by the standards of the 21st century, we're going to get ourselves in and make ourselves look very foolish. I mean, there are things that people said in the past which we wouldn't say today, but that doesn't mean that we need to go rooting through the past, sort of finding all examples of this, I think. And there are things that we say today that 50 years from now people are going to find absolutely ridiculous and indeed reprehensible. So I see my role as trying to understand. It is perfectly clear that some people and some actions in the past are morally reprehensible, but I think I'd prefer to let the reader draw his or her conclusion for that. The other thing is I think we have to be careful when we're looking at the past to understand the ways in which language was used then. I'll just give you one example. In the 19th century, people often talked about race, and sometimes they meant race in the way it's meant today. You know, a false assumption that there are clearly distinguishable races in the human species, and they're distinguished by such things as color. And that concept, I think, is increasingly seen as just unscientific and not based on anything that is biologically based. But often in the 19th century, people used race when today we'd say ethnic group or nation. And so when people talk about the white race, they sometimes mean it in that racial terms. They sometimes mean it simply in the sense of Europeans. You get people talking about the British race. Do they mean it racially, or do they simply mean the British people or the British nation? And so I think we always need to try and understand, not to excuse, but to understand why people are using certain terms in certain ways. And sometimes the meaning of those terms has changed over time. And I think that's important. I mean, I'm not sure I'm all that thrilled now with the sort of current wave of taking down statues and removing names and changing names. I mean, and my own view is it's better to try and explain and let people understand. I mean, in Oxford we had a huge row, rather like the one here over Sir John A. Macdonald, about Cecil Rhodes.
Yes.
And should his statue come down? Well, most of us had never known the statue was up there because it was way up in a building. And it had been under scaffolding for about 3 years. But anyway, it became a great issue. And I think the feeling of most of us in Oxford was, yes, he did do some things we wouldn't approve of today. Some of what he said, however, was taken out of context and used to portray him as a genocidal maniac, which I think wasn't fair. And my own sense was better keep the statue up and put an explanatory plaque. And, you know, have a link to a website which explains a bit more about him and let people make up their own minds. But it's a tricky subject, but I sometimes worry that, you know, we'll go around taking down every statue and then we'll forget who those people were and why they were important.
Thank you.
I can see by the clock on the wall that it's time to, sorry, that's another show, Wayne and Schuster. It is one thing to receive an erudite talk that someone's had the time to prepare and to research, but the true scope of the knowledge of a scholar is the way that they're able to field the questions, not rehearsed questions that come from the audience. And I think if we had need of more evidence of the scholarship of our speaker, I think we have it now. So. Thank you very much for your questions.
Thanks again. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you both. You've been so kind. Thank you.
As we draw to a close, I would like to thank Premier Wade McLaughlin, Dr. Ed McDonald, the Confederation Centre Youth Course for their participation in today's lecture, and of course our 2018 Symons Medal recipient, Dr. Margaret MacMillan.
Voyant cette belle assistance, on vous dit merci à tous d'être venus à la remise de la médaille de la causerie Symons 2018. Nous espérons avoir le plaisir de vous revoir l'an prochain. We look forward to seeing you next year. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the departure of the Viceregal Party. Veuillez demeurer à vos places pendant le départ du cortège vice-royal. Also, please don't forget to return your headsets on your way out of the theater. Thank you. Mesdames et messieurs, n'oubliez pas de remettre vos écouteurs aux préposés placés aux portes du théâtre. Merci et bonne fin de journée.